I first became interested in synthetic biology about 10 years ago, and I was fascinated that engineers were coming into genetic engineering, biology, and talking about design. And I began to wonder, well, what will they design? And how will we know what good design is and who gets to decide? And for the last 10 years, I've been finding lots of different ways to ask that question and learning a lot along the way. The project Designing for the Sixth Extinction began when I went to a conference in 2013, and at this conference synthetic biologists and conservationists were meeting for the first time. And these aren't two groups of people that you would normally see in a room together. In fact, they're very unlikely to be together, and they were talking about how they might be able to work together, or if each field would actually be a problem for the other. And I was incredibly fascinated by this. Conservationists are looking backwards, trying to protect biodiversity from humanity, and synthetic biologists are looking forwards, trying to invent and design new biodiversity for the same humanity. And one of the things that came up was, would it be possible to save nature by infecting it with designed organisms? For example, engineering coral so it could withstand warmer waters. And as I was listening to this, I became completely fascinated and wondered, well, what would the wilds look like in this future? And ultimately, who would get to decide? The project itself presents the design of 4 fictional organisms, and the organisms are only presented through the language of patent applications. And I use the patent application language as a narrative device. So if we completely instrumentalize living things into objects, how do we talk about them? They become devices and machines. And this is where kind of the idea of care becomes really different. So the synthetic biologist trying to solve a problem as an engineer and a designer designing an organism to support another organism, you start to get into this very grey area about why are we even preserving the organisms. So for example, one of the objects or machines is the self-inflating antipathogenic membrane pump, and it's presented as a patent design for a kind of fungus that infects serum into infected trees. We start to get into this very strange feedback loop. Like, why are we saving these trees? Why are they not able to exist on their own? Design and human intentions have intervened in the landscape, so we design more things to solve the problem of those problems. And that's where I start to get kind of confused by the story myself. Is like, what is the designer doing? Is the conservationist solution, which is just trying to protect and ring fence, ever going to work in our current environment? And I would argue that loss of biodiversity tells us no, whereas the synthetic biologists are very optimistic and say, well, design and engineering can help us solve these problems, we just need to put our minds to it, and that's enough. So these 4 objects, machines, living robots, however we describe them, are all fictional. They're not real or in development, but each starts to open up real questions for me around applying intellectual property and human values onto nature to try and solve its problems. And so why has it got problems? Well, they're human caused, and do we even need to solve it? And that's where the project really gets to this deeper question of industrializing nature completely. By doing that, will it even exist for us to save? My fascination with design is it's a very human thing to do, and the reason I like Herbert Simon's definition, the political scientist who talked about design as a process to change an existing situation to a preferred one. And then we have to say, well, what is the preferred situation and whose preferred situation? And that's what my PhD research was about. I was looking at what is better, what is better design? And that's something that I think is, design has got caught up in making things better for a capitalist system, i.e. making things that we consume and sell and dispose of. And I'm very curious how design can work to other ideas of better. So could it be, we can look back in the 20th century to examples of socialist design, or we can look to co-design or other kinds of design practices. But the idea that design can only make stuff that we sell, I think, is erroneous. I think there's so much more. Design can help us uncover possibility and help us also examine the kinds of futures we want, and thus the kinds of changes that we need to make in the present. Because that's where I really think change needs to happen.